Welcome everybody. Week 5 between Psyche and Mind. Today we will talk about one of the most important elements in our discussion of mind and body in critical neuroscience, and we will examine recollection, talking to the mind, and mind talking, and we will even venture into some aspects of behavioral neuroscience. Now, this will be part 1 of this conversation because we will continue next week. And we will also explore some elements of diversity and inclusion as part of our discussions in this course. But without further ado, let's begin with the first analysis for this week. So this is one of those weeks that are very philosophically profound in my mind and in my psyche, I dare to say, because we will really switch gears. Now, in the first 4 weeks, we have a solid understanding of at least the most basic biological, neurological factors that are essential to really understand what neuroscience is and what it can produce in terms of developing knowledge. We also spend quite a bit of time to understandings, to the understanding of some psychological parameters according to which we can interpret our behavior, our thoughts, and our emotions. And we also analyze some of the theoretical constructs in theoretical medicine, in philosophy as a whole, and we mention a few models regarding awareness, consciousness, computation, and an overall understanding of what makes us human. Now, this week, the conversation will take on a more spiritual perspective and even theological perspective to some extent. And of course, this is neither a course in philosophy nor theology, but the idea of psyche and mind cannot be fully understood unless we take into account some of those transcendental elements. Now, what does it mean to talk about the mind? What does it mean to have this comparison between talking to the mind and mind talking? Well, a basic answer to this will be, well, psychotherapy, talk therapy. Talk therapy is essential as described by talking to someone's mind, to addressing cognitive processes. Not necessarily because we are talking about cognitive processes, but because we're using words to convey concepts, a message to our audience, to our clients, to our patients. And this is true whether we are indeed practicing psychotherapy, so within mental health, but it's also true in any conversation predicated upon this patient-provider relationship. For instance, when we apply motivational interviewing techniques, when we coach someone about a specific area of the biopsychosocial model, and we want to foster positive behavior change. But it's also true for pretty much the entirety of human communication, whether this is constructed only on verbal mode of communication or also paraverbal, non-verbal, metalinguistics, and we analyze facial expressions and posture and so on and so forth. So, talking to the mind and mind talking. Now, mind and psyche are two terms that are connected and yet they indicate a very different approach. Now, we mentioned this before. Is psyche the old metaphor, archetype of the butterfly, the thing that will allow us to exist as human beings? Is a part or shared part with a soul or a spirit that enters our body upon birth and leaves our body upon biological death? Or is mind a better framework for the psyche is, to the point that we can simply separate anything that is transcendental from what is mechanistically explainable? A few weeks ago, we talked briefly about reductionism and materialism, or materialist reductionist, or reductionist materialism, and we mentioned a few philosophers, for instance, the Churchlands, Paul and Patricia, and we also venture into the possibility that one thing could explain away the other. Now, is it still the case? Well, this week we will begin by an overall analysis of the existence of a mind or a psyche, and we will also see what this means from the perspective of the broader discussion, because every time we think about a mind separated from the body, or connected to the body but not equivalent to the body, the biggest elephant in the room appears. And this has to do with our purpose and meaning as human beings. Do we have a soul? And if we do possess a soul, is this soul individually based? So in other words, is it something that we can use to identify ourselves as ourselves? Or is something more of a shared soul? Is there a difference between this shared soul as in spirit that animates all of us, principle of life, vitalism or vitalism, from the Latin word for life, so vita, equivalent of the Greek bios or bios, which is in itself connected to this life force, vis robur in Latin, so bios, vis, or is something that is our ID, it's really the representation for our identity. And even that, is this synonymous with an universal, transcendental, and I dare to say, abstract soul, or is it something that we can recognize even in the afterlife? Is our soul enduring biological death or not? And if it does endure biological death, is it still recognizable as our soul, as ourself, or not? So those are some of the questions we'll try to address today. And of course, this is not the first time that those questions have been addressed in philosophy. It's you could even say that because of their transcendental and spiritual nature, a lot of these questions can be addressed in a specific area of philosophy. And of course, I mean a specific area of philosophy connected to theology. And I'm thinking about apologetics. Now, this has a lot of connection with certain argumentations for the existence of an afterlife, or the existence of God, and even existence of a personal God, for instance. And I think about mathematical models, for instance, Gödel model, but I also think about standard discussions and philosophical debates that originate in scholasticism, in Thomistic understanding. So Thomas Aquinas, for instance. I'm thinking about the ontological proofs or the cosmological proof, and whether proof is the correct term or supposed to be a more of a mathematical demonstration. And we also talk about the burden of proof, whether certain statements warrant intrinsic demonstration or they're supposed to be considered as the pre-existing condition, as an a priori idea that has to be dealt with, rationally speaking, as the process unfolds. So this is the very beginning of this debate. And of course, there is no way that you can possibly address all aspects of apologetics or even of theology and philosophy of mind in one single course. But I hope I'll do my best to present the vast majority of these philosophical arguments for and against the existence and separation between psyche and mind. So let's begin with the first analysis. So even before we begin venturing to the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, and thinking about medieval scholastic philosophy and theology and the connection with the other monotheistic Jewish and Islamic counterparts, and also outside of the Western Middle Eastern philosophical tradition, we have to think about some of the parameters that we inherit from classical philosophy, so to speak. I'm going to use classical in a very external sense, so I don't even want to distinguish between pre-Socratic philosophy or Hellenistic as opposed to classical philosophy in ancient Greece and Rome. But let's start with Plato. I think Plato will be a good place to start. So when we think about existence, when we think about conceptualization of self, we think about remembering, reminding, recollecting. If you remember, no pun intended, we talked about this in week 2. And one of the first terms that I would like to bring to your attention here is, the very concept of anamnesis in Plato. Okay, so recollection and anamnesis are truly at the intersection of psyche and mind, and they're intended as either two separate entities or two aspects of the same thing. Okay, now this is connected to the Latin term res, R-E-S, right, as in res publica, republic. Recollecting is obviously connected to reconnecting, remembering, and memorizing. Okay? This activity is at the center of the discussion on remembered wellness, faith factor, and relaxation response in a spiritual and religious sense. Now, this is something that is very, very important because from a purely therapeutic perspective, the studies are really, really clear. I always shy away, so to speak, from claiming any direct proof of something, because in science we have to be very careful in how we use our terms. But if there's something that seems to be quite relevant, is the fact that in the vast majority of cases, individuals that have a solid spiritual or religious background are performing much better in the context of mental health disorder. Now, by performing, I do understand that this term is somewhat a misconstructed concept. We simply mean that they score better in terms of rates of, for instance, depression, anxiety, and overall suicide rates. Now, one of the things to remember here is that this does not contain any ontological argumentation, any causal factor about what it means to be a spiritual or religious person. And you could also claim that there should be a big distinction between spirituality and religiosity, or even between religiosity and religion. And it's also not true that just because something makes you feel good, it automatically contains some proof of its reality, okay? Its causal factors. In other words, you might find that these rates are true, but they don't actually demonstrate the existence of a God, of an afterlife, or of a soul. And also there could be some confounding element, which, by the way, was analyzed multiple times, and all the links to these studies and meta-analysis are found below in the description. Either you could say that a person might be more, let's use the term, spiritual as a result of their depression, or a person might be more depressed as a result of their spirituality or religiosity. For instance, if a person becomes more depressed because of their religiosity, this might be due to the fact that there are certain expectations, moral, ethical, behavioral expectation in belonging to a specific religion, for instance. And this pressure that might or might not be theologically sound, but it's anyway relevant because of the behavior of the members of the community, might add pressure to a person's behavior, making this person more and more depressed in this context, and possibly suicidal. This is one possible explanation. Or the opposite, that because a person is, to begin with, more depressed, this person might find solace in a religious belief or religious practice. Very distinct things, by the way, okay? Because we always need to keep in mind that the term itself, religion, is linked. It's binding together. So the practice is as relevant as the belief system. It's a ritualistic component, despite of big discussions and debate in different philosophies in this context. So this could be, to some extent, qualified as, well, you are unable to process the absurdity of life. This is something that might remind us of Sartre and Camus. And because you cannot resist the constant pressure that your free will is determined upon you, this is just one explanation, and the fact that you don't know what to do with your existence itself, then you're more prone to create from scratch, we could argue, an imaginary figure that you might be more prone to view as an anthropomorphic element. So you make yourself your own God, and you pray to this God, that you have this belief in the afterlife and to an ultimate intrinsic meaning and purpose in life, simply because you're too naive, too gullible, or simply too weak to resist life. Now, this is a very cynical perspective, we might argue, unless it's true, of course, in which case we will have to ask ourselves the question, well, what's the best option? To be focused on ignorance is bliss, or on truth will set you free, so to speak? Will we rather be ignorant and happy, or fully conscious and aware but very, very sad? Well, this might be one explanation, and yet the solid evidence indicates that what seems to be the best strategy for disable mental health disorder, and again, I want to specify that this discussion for now, it's only meant to address depression, suicidality, and anxiety. It's not meant to, for the time being, to address things such as psychosis or schizophrenia. Okay, there might be evidence in the area, but it is not the scope of this discussion for today. So solid evidence indicates that those patterns of behavior on one side and belief system are by far the best chance to obtain and maintain psychological health. And there are plenty of other studies that actually indicate that this is true also from physical health, which might be actually an extra leverage, if not a proof, that what is a truth-bearing mechanism can have positive repercussion throughout the biopsychosocial model. Now, to rephrase this, just because a person feels better as a result of their spirituality, it does not mean that what they believe is true. However, connecting this discussion to what we said last week, and especially to this archetype of the good with a capital G, okay, not surprisingly connected to the Proto-Indo-European term for God, good and God, right, is in itself a quite relevant element for the discussion of a possible intrinsic validity. So last week we mentioned the connection between good as in aesthetically pleasant, what makes us feel good using our senses, and good in terms of adaptive, precise, effective. Okay, so what looks good is good. For instance, a big discussion in psycholinguistics in this context is whether shape and function create concept, or whether it's the other way around, whether concept creates function and shape. For instance, whether a hammer is both shape and concept for something that is utilized as hammering device, okay? Or whether those things can be separate. In any case, to begin with, the concept of making something our own is connected to spirituality simply because it appears to be, at least from the statistical perspective, that contemplating some level of spirituality appears to make the whole system work in a much better way. This could also be connected to levels of anxiety and other medical comorbidities. Think about heart rate, think about type A, type B personality. And of course, this is not necessarily relevant to the discussion of mind and body, but it's extremely relevant in a therapeutic sense, whether we want to take type A and type B, or whether we're talking about A, B, C, D, or cluster A, B, and C in the context of personality disorder in the DSM area. The idea is this: the more we feel better psychologically, the better we feel physically, and the other way around. So last week we mentioned that a very poor advice to give is, well, as long as it makes you feel good, this is good for you. This is extremely dangerous because our ability to perceive the world might be in itself compromised. And this has to do, by the way, with the sensus spiritualis, okay, or sensus spiritualis that we mentioned a few weeks ago. So this means that our ability to perceive the world, including the hypothetical transcendental world, the spiritual ethereal world, might be compromised, so that we cannot entirely rely on our sensory capacity, our perception, and our aesthetic abilities to know what is good. So where else do we find truth? Where else do we find the good list of rules and regulation we need to utilize to make ourselves feel better? Now, it's often mentioned in psychology that human beings don't come with an instruction manual, and so we have two main options. Either we find out rules on our own, or we create our own rules and verify whether those rules match with the rest of the rules, as in my liberty and freedom ends where another human being's liberty and freedom starts. Or we can assume that there's something more universal about human existence, and that those rules do not have a human origin or even a biological origin, but by themselves they are transcendental. So let's see if those conversations are to some extent rational enough to be considered in this week. Now, in regard to this, one of the authors that is quoted in the text was Herbert Benson, and he described the fundamental nature of human beings as, quote, wired for God, in connection to this process and at the base of the healing process. So in connection to the process of remembering wellness, remembering how to feel good, to the faith factor and the relaxation response, okay? And toward health and well-being in general. Now, from a scientific standpoint, this position is validated by numerous studies. For instance, the research by Levin in connection to general medical practice and Wiederquist for nursing. Another one that we mentioned last week is the work by Louis Ritz at the intersection between psyche and mind, which is the cornerstone of the Center for Spirituality and Health at the University of Florida. Now, this notes that spirituality deals with what we find eternal, beautiful, meaningful, and just, and asks us to contemplate what should be. Science and technology deal with much more what is and how best to predict and manipulate it. The interface between these powerful forces is of immense and immediate importance because their interaction is likely to strongly influence how the next generation shape the future of our world. Careful analysis of our debates about healthcare, ecology, economics, politics, nationalism, educational policies, and even law often reveal this underlying conflict between faith and fact-based realities. Now, of course, the assumption here is that those realities are separate, and on one side you have fact, as in evidence, empirical, scientific knowledge, and on the other side you have faith as either the absence of enough reason or, unfortunately, despite of the existence of these rational reasons. And this is something that I always find myself in conflict with, the idea that faith and spirituality should be against science. Now, this is nothing new in the conversation on the level of apologetics, but the idea that they should be complementary is something that dates back to time immemorial, and in more recent times, in my recent time I think about, again, Thomas Aquinas, we could think of nature and faith as two different languages, written by the same author, so to speak. And so either you get if there is any mismatch between what you can observe with science and what you can know through faith, and again, faith in a broader sense, spirituality, if there's any discrepancy or conflict between these two, either you're making a mistake in your scientific analysis and you had to study your science much better and be much better in utilizing the scientific method. In other words, you made an error, a mathematical error, a statistical error, a study construct error, a theoretical analysis error. In any case, your science is wrong, or your faith might be wrong. Okay? There has to be a common element because one thing created the other. Now, of course, for the materialist reduction perspective, science, usually embodied by evolutionary biology, created faith, or rather created God, or an image and liking we have. According to the opposite perspective, the scholastic perspective we just mentioned, the other way around is true. So we have an innate sense of the divine, of God, of spirituality, and if we interpret that sense appropriately, in other words, if our perceptive mechanism for the divine, our sensus divinitatis, sensus spiritualis, is intact, then we'll be able to verify those claims in science directly. So why is this all relevant in a course on critical neuroscience? Well, all these discussions are wonderful from a philosophical perspective, but the idea is this: a cornerstone of what we're trying to do here is to understand how free we really are. It's still connected to the free will / free want debate. And so one of the classical argumentation for this argument is that either we as human beings have free will, and by that we simply mean we are able to make more or less informed decisions in our behavior, in our thoughts, in our everyday action, right? Or we don't. And therefore, we cannot be responsible for what happens to us. We don't have any level of accountability or responsibility. And this goes back to what we said about the locus of control and locus of responsibility. And we can actually never know who we are. As in, can we really claim that everything about being human is really us, including our accomplishments, including our failures, including our performance? So for instance, in a therapeutic sense, this is straightforward, right? Because we mentioned this before. One of the dangers of the nature-nurture debate is to be extremist in either case, right? And the video about depression that I linked, I think in week 1, talks exactly about that. One of the dangers is to think that we are only our neurotransmitters, and therefore we don't have any free will, so it doesn't matter what type of therapy we do, nothing will change, unless we can only focus psychopharmacology. Or the other way is like, of course, everything is only about nurture, so it's nothing to do with our genetic makeup, and therefore we should take responsibility for our mental state, okay? This is much more complex than that, but this is just a quick summary for the sake of this discussion. I will advise you to watch the video on depression to find more about that. But in any case, the idea is this. Why study in the first place unless there is some level of incremental capacity to either develop those skills, mnemonics, the ability to learn more, and whether this is something that has to do with you specifically. Now, the basic element is just to find satisfaction. Okay? The term satisfaction means to make fulfill, or to fill something up, right? Satisfaction in Latin. And so that you can be proud, in other words, of your accomplishment, but also from a very practical perspective, whether this element makes sense at all. Because why would you be awarded a degree if you didn't play a role in that? It's just your brain. Your brain should be awarded a degree. And does this even make sense to award a degree to a brain? This is really not a joke. I'm trying to think about the possible rational decision-making property that will underlie such practice, even from a strictly legal and socio-political perspective. Now, in this context, whenever we think about free will, we think about certain experiments, because we can think of free will from a strictly theoretical philosophical perspective, and some of the philosophers we just mentioned do a wonderful job in analyzing that. So the classic from Socrates and Plato all the way to the scholastic element. So Thomas Aquinas, we can think of Augustine, we can think of all the way to Hegel and Heidegger and so on and so forth. But we are also interested in empirical evidence-based science in order to provide more proof of the existence or non-existence of free will. So one of the most important experiments in this context, or is one of the most quoted experiments in this context, is the Libet Experiment that wanted to investigate the concept of Bereitschaftspotential. And this is something that I really encourage you to review. I will include a link below of the experiment itself, and also understanding whether this experiment is connected to the opposite. So free will, the ability to perform a task and have awareness of the fact that we perform this task, we are responsible and aware of that, as opposed to free want, okay? The ability to have some sort of intrinsic veto capacity, veto power, to, in other words, say no to the potentiality and the possibility to do that. For instance, I have or I don't have free will to, to wave my hand, okay? So I'm empowered, responsible, and able to perform these skills really before any sensory motor element, okay? We're not talking about just the neural underpinnings of my movement, okay, and how much I perceive my hand moving, but whether there is something about me that tells my hand to move, okay? Or even more so, if there's something about me that tells my brain to tell my hand to move. Or whether right before I actually execute my movement, if I have the capacity not to move my hand, okay, so this veto power. So let's analyze just real quick this experiment. Although again, I will like to ask you to review the video to better understand. Okay, with this term we can translate the concept of readiness potential. Okay, so it's the conscious experience of volition on one side, okay, and the readiness potential on the other side. Now, in previous elements of debate, researchers such as Kornhuber and Decke were able to demonstrate that a basic hand movement in the subject studied between a certain initial nervous activity in the motor cortex of a subject and its actual execution by the subject, about 1 second elapsed. Okay, so
about 1 second between the initial nervous activity in the motor cortex and the actual execution. So there's some delay there. Although our human everyday experience that the time between action and execution appears much shorter, so that we think that we did it, okay? So we think that we decided to activate the hand movement. Now, in the experiment I just mentioned, the Libet Experiment, the repeated results show that instead that this Bereitschaftspotential, this readiness potential, began about 0.35 seconds earlier than the subject reported conscious awareness. That now he or she feels the desire to make a movement. Now this is fundamental because the fact that it originates before the awareness of the subject appears to indicate that the subject is not aware really. Okay, so this demonstrates that in spite of the appearance, in spite of this perception, humans has no free will in the initiation of the movements. Now this is extremely important because, first of all, if you don't have any other theoretical or analytical structure, you might believe that this is all you need to demonstrate the non-existence of free will, and the fact that whatever we thought we are, it doesn't exist. So never mind concepts such as mind or soul. We don't really exist as beings separate from our neurological underpinnings. We're nothing but our neurological underpinnings, because it kind of makes sense, at least at first observation, that this is only a pseudo awareness. We are really not aware because this happens again 0.35 earlier, okay, than the awareness of the fact that we move the hand. But let's continue. And since we mentioned the cosmological argument and ontological argument, we could start with that first. Now, the cosmological argument, it's also called the first cause argument, or the Kalam cosmological argument, and it's pretty straightforward. It has only 3 steps. The first one is whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. And in this context, in terms of the Big Bang theory, we really have to acknowledge the fact that, to the best of our knowledge, that is indeed a scientific fact. Okay, and for that proof, we have to thank a Catholic priest, a Belgian Catholic priest in that sense. But in any case, this is something that we could use as a fact for a time, for the sake of conversation. So 2, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore the universe has a cause. Okay, so this is cosmological arguments. Now, if you think about, from cosmos, right, first cause. Now, if you think about the ontological argument, now ontology has to do with the study of what is, study of being. Okay, ontos in Greek, right, ente or ens in Latin. Now, this is a type of argument that has some level of connection with Descartes, with Cartesian philosophy, dualism, René Descartes, as well as with St. Anselm, right? Now, this has to do with this self-evident type of argument. You could sum up with this, like, if you have something that is contained in a clear and distinct idea of a thing, so whatever is contained in a clear and distinct idea of a thing must be predicated of that thing. But a clear and distinct idea of an absolutely perfect being contains the idea of an actual existence. Therefore, since we have the idea of an absolutely perfect being, namely God, such being must really exist. Now, this is to some extent connected to what we said earlier about Alvin, Plantinga, as well as Gödel, I would say. But that's one of the shortest way to describe the ontological argument. Now, since we mentioned Aquinas, we had to spend just a few seconds about his 5 ways, the 5 ways to demonstrate, logically speaking, the existence of God in the Summa Theologica. Let me rephrase this. There's no way you can possibly account for all arguments and counter-arguments against Aquinas. In my personal opinion, the counter-arguments do not have solid logical evidence. But in any case, I'm doing my best to sum up everything in a few seconds. So, the first element is the unmoved mover. The second one is called usually first cause, which is very, very similar to the cosmological arguments, pretty much synonymous. Then you have the necessary being. You have the argument for degree, and finally you have the argument or proof from final cause. Now, if you start from the beginning, right, the unmoved mover arguments pretty much says that
since we experience motion in our world, in the universe, and motion means something that becomes, that it's actualized, it's a transition for what is potential to what is actual. Since we have that, we can see that there must have been an initial mover. Now, Thomas Aquinas argued that whatever is in motion must be put in motion by something else, by another thing. So there has to be something as an unmoved mover. And so that's the first proof. Now, the second one, the first cause, starts with one premise. And the premise, according to Aquinas, that it is impossible for a being to cause itself, because it would have to exist before it caused itself. And it is impossible for there to be an infinite chain of causes which will result in infinite regress. Therefore, there must be a first cause, itself uncaused. Now, this has to do with the conceptualization of time that, according to classical scholastics and theology, is God itself, simply because time and space did not exist before. The argument from a necessary being asserts that all beings are contingent. Okay, so think about transcendental, think about contingent. So contingent meaning that it's possible for them not to exist. Okay, there is a possibility for the non-existence of these beings. Now, in this proof, Thomas Aquinas argued that if everything can possibly non-exist, there must have been a time when nothing existed. As things exist now, therefore there must exist a being with necessary existence, which in this proof is regarded or identified as God. Now, the argument from degree has to do with, similar to what we said about consciousness, degrees or stages, by this time, of goodness. Okay? Think about what we said earlier about the term kalos or veloci in Latin. Okay, good and the application of it. So according to this proof, there are things that are called good, and they're called good because they can be in relation. They can be called good in relation to a standard of good. Okay, a degree, a maximum. So there must be a maximum, quote unquote, goodness, that which causes all goodness. All right. So this is a hierarchical type of argument. And finally, the final cause argument, which asserts that view that non-intelligent objects are ordered toward a purpose. Now, specifically, Aquinas argued that these objects cannot be ordered unless they are done so by an intelligent being, which means that there must be an intelligent being to move objects to their ends, which, according to this theory, to go to the proof, is God. Now, this is extremely important. I mean, they're all very important. But there's something that has to do with what we just said about evolutionary biology in the context of neuroscience. And if you remember what we said, it was regarding the ultimate goal. So if we think about evolution, it is absolutely rational to identify evolution in all categories, evolution in biology, evolution in psychology, evolution in neuroscience, as a series of steps that might follow a certain hierarchical pattern, and then we can identify as, moving from stage A to B to C and so on and so forth. But this does not account for the very notion of a progress. So how can we even imply that there is such thing as a scientific progress were it not for certain parameters outside of science that tells us what is good? Now, this really goes against some misinterpretation of philosophers such as Hume, for instance, that are on the mechanistic, objectivistic, functional or functionalist perspective, which means that we know that science improves because science has quote unquote all the answers, including the answer of its own existence and validity. And this is logically inconsistent, because we cannot have a hierarchy of values were it not for something exists outside of the very practice that we're talking about. So again, I want to restate the fact that the main reason why we bring this to your attention, what I talked about, the argument for the existence of God, it's not to discuss theological argumentation in themselves, simply to provide this logical, sequential argument-like structure of analysis that you will utilize to verify certain claims about the existence of a soul, a mind, or a spirit as a separate entity from our bodies. Now, this is very important because the assumption that I made at the beginning of this semester is the assumption that we have to base all our interrogation on solid scientific evidence. I am still embracing that view because I do believe that something that we can all agree upon is the fact that science, by definition, in terms of our observation, is objective. Certainly there might be certain mistakes, but the mistakes are not in the scientific method per se, but they are mistakes due to the fallible element within human perception and interpretation. In other words, we can make mistakes either in creating our scientific research, our studies, or we can make mistakes in interpreting the data. Those are human mistakes that might be either minimized or in some cases even magnified by the utilization of brain-computer interfaces, algorithms, and other statistical, epidemiological, quantitative calculation and devices. However, this is an assumption that makes sense under these parameters, but I want to make sure that we understand that it's also a limitation, specific limitation on an ontological level, for the very fact that science in itself cannot account for itself the same way as we said this before. So I just want to point this out as the main reason why I brought this to your attention. Thank you very much for your attention. As promised, we will continue our conversation on psyche and mind, and mind-body connection next week. And so I will see you all in week 6, and thank you for your contribution to our weekly discussion on diversity and inclusion. Bye-bye.